3.2 is about independent and dependent variables. And depending on where you are in biology right now, you may actually have already talked about this. And if not, you're getting a little preview for what's to come. Independent and dependent variables are highly related to science. It's something you're going to see all the time when you're testing variables and identifying relationships between things. We're going to talk about them specifically in terms of functions later on in this unit, but we're still going to be able to identify what is an independent variable and what is a dependent variable. And today our goal is that you can read through a problem or look at an equation and you can identify what variable is independent and what variable is dependent. We're going to focus on the idea of what a function is in 3.3, but the basic idea of what we're talking about is that we have some input, something like x, for example, that's getting put into something. That is our independent variable, the thing that's getting put in, where we're starting, independent. Something is going to happen while it's in there, and that's going to get our output, and that our output is that dependent variable. So what we put in determines what comes out. So there's a bunch of different terms that are all used to represent independent variables, and that are all of these green terms on the left. Independent variables are often referred to as the x values, the domain, the input, the x's. Dependent variables are often talked about as the y values, the range, the output, f of x, which we'll focus on that f of x notation in 3.3. So these words tie together exactly the same way that they do in the English language. If something is independent, nothing else determines that value or that variable. The dependent variable or the dependent item depends on the independent item. So for example, my children are referred to as dependents because they depend on me. I am independent. I don't depend on anybody. I take care of myself. So independent variables, independent items are what determines what happens to the dependent items. The dependent items rely on the independent items. So we're going to just look real briefly at some examples of some problems and identify in that sentence what is dependent and what is independent. And what I really want you to be asking yourself is, what determines the other item? What causes the other item to change? That's going to really be the question that you want to keep in your mind. What causes the other item to change? What changes depending on the original item? So identify the independent and dependent variables. A painter must measure a room to decide how much paint to buy. So you're asking yourself, the measurement of the room, does that determine how much paint to buy, or how much paint do I buy? Does that determine the size of the room? Which is dependent on the other? Well, if I buy more paint, does that change the size of the room? If I have a larger measure, does that change the amount of paint that I buy? Logically, it should. So our independent variable is going to be the size of the room or the measurements of the room. Our dependent variable is going to be the amount of paint that we buy. So again, the amount of paint is dependent on the size of the room. The size of the room determines the amount of paint that I'm going to buy. Question 2, the height of a candle decreases each hour that it burns, right? Because the candle is melting. So the height of the candle decreases each hour that it burns. So what are the two variables that we're talking about here? The height of the candle is obviously one. Hours, so time, is a second. The height of the candle decreases each hour that it burns. So what is determining the other? Is the height of the candle telling me how many hours have passed, or is the number of hours determining the height of the candle? So I'm going to give you a little secret. 99% of the time is going to be your independent variable because we can't control time. That makes your dependent variable the height of the candle. This is true because the longer that time goes on with the candle being lit, the lower the height of the candle is going to be. So independent variable is time because the more time that passes, the more the candle burns. The candle isn't burning if time is standing still. And if you can make time stand still, we got to talk. Number 3, a vet weighs an animal to determine the dosage of medication. So we're talking about the weight of an animal and the dosage of medication. Go ahead and pause this video and see if you can figure out which is independent and which is dependent. Okay, a vet weighs an animal. The weight determines the dosage. So if a dog weighs more, it's going to get a higher dosage. If a dog weighs less, it's going to get a lower dosage. So the weight is our independent variable because it is determining the dosage, which is our dependent variable. So those are 3 examples that we just looked at. I always get asked the question, is there any case where time is dependent? And I'm going to give you just one example. There are a handful of examples, but remember, you should always be asking yourself the question, what is causing the other variable to increase or decrease, or what is dependent on something else? So here's an example. I'm not going to write it down. I'm just going to explain it to you. Here's an example of where time could be the dependent variable. If I have to drive 60 miles, how fast I drive determines how long it will take for me to get there. So the independent variable there would be my speed. My speed determines how long, which is time. My speed determines the dependent variable, which is time, for how long it would take me to get there. So there's one example where time is, in fact, the dependent variable. Again, always ask yourself what you have control of and what depends on something else. Now let's tie this back to equations, which is what we've been looking at all year. So given the equation y equals 3x minus 1, find y for each of these x values. And we're going to write those answers as ordered pairs. So I'm going to do the first one, then I'm going to have you go ahead and pause this video and work through the other 2. So I'm going to plug in -1. So y equals 3, and that's where I'm going to plug in the variable, times my x value minus 1. If I plug in -1, I'm getting -3 minus 1, which is -4. So this ordered pair would be -1, -4. When I plug in -1, I get -4. Go ahead and pause the video and work through the second 2. So y equals 3 times 0 minus 1. 3 times 0 is 0. Minus 1 is -1. And then the next one, y equals 3 times 1 minus 1. Well, that's going to be 2. 3 minus 1 is 2. So each of these can be written as an ordered pair. The x value was the input. The y value was the output. The x value was what the number we were told to plug in was. The y value is what happened when we plugged in that x value. So think about this. In number 4, which variable was independent? Or which variable caused the other variable to change? That would be x. X was independent because x determined our y value, which means that our dependent variable was y. Y changed based on the value of x that we plugged in. So it changed based on x. Can you give an example where the opposite is true? Well, that would probably be an equation where we had x set up and we were doing something to y. Here now, it would make more sense to plug in values for y to find x. So it is possible that x is not our independent variable based on the type of equation that we're looking at. But for the most part, we're going to talk about x being our independent variable and y being our dependent variable. So going back to that essential question, how do we identify independent and dependent variables? Make sure you're asking yourself the question, what variable controls the other variable, or what variable determines the other variable? Or on the flip side, which variable depends on the other variable to happen? Talk through those situations when you're looking at word problems. Identify what those 2 variables are first, and then identify which one causes the other one or has an effect on the other one. Looking forward to working with more examples on independent and dependent variables with you in class. Thanks for listening.